The email arrived on a Tuesday, a day like any other, filled with the stale scent of old paper and the hollow echo of my own frustrated sighs. My workspace, a cramped corner of my apartment that doubled as a bedroom and a pantry, was a testament to my life's work. Piles of books teetering precariously, stacks of brittle manuscripts threatening to crumble at a breath, and the faint, ever-present aroma of dust. Academia, I discovered, was less about the thrill of uncovering forgotten truths and more about the slow, soul-crushing grind of grant applications and peer reviews that felt more like professional sabotage than constructive criticism. My research into obscure folklore, once a burning passion, had curdled into a bitter obsession, a lonely pursuit in a world that valued spreadsheets over specters. Then, the subject line, inheritance notification. I'd almost deleted it, another piece of unsolicited junk mail. But the sender's name, a distant branch of my family tree I'd never encountered, snagged my attention. A gray tant, twice removed, apparently. My only living relative of any consequence had been my grandfather, a man whose stories were as dry as the parchment he collected. This unexpected windfall, however, was less about monetary value and more about a place, a property, an entire manor. The details were vague, buried in legalese I barely understood, but the address was specific. A remote corner of the countryside, miles from any semblance of civilization. The accompanying link led me to a listing for an Airbnb in rural area. Reviews don't match reality. The photos were unsettling. A sprawling Gothic edifice, its stone walls stained with the patina of centuries, windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy, moss-laden brows. The description spoke of rustic charm and unparalleled tranquility, but the images whispered of neglect, of a place that had long since surrendered to the encroaching wild. The reviews, predictably, were a bizarre mix of glowing accolades and cryptic warnings. One guest raved about the unique atmosphere, while another, with a single, stark sentence, simply stated, "Do not stay here alone." My academic brain, starved for any flicker of genuine mystery, latched onto the discord. This wasn't just a house, it was a story waiting to be unearthed. The drive was a pilgrimage of increasing isolation. Paved roads dissolved into gravel tracks, and the gentle hum of the engine was swallowed by the rustling of unseen things in the dense woods that pressed in on either side. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. My small car, a sputtering relic of my financial struggles, felt like a toy dropped into a forgotten corner of the world. As the trees finally parted, the manor loomed. It was far grander and far more dilapidated than the photographs had suggested. Furniture, draped in faded sheets, stood like shrouded figures in the gloom. I wandered through the echoing halls, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the flagstone floors. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow me, lined the walls. Each room was a tableau of decay, a testament to time and abandonment. In the library, the shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound volumes, their pages brittle and foxed. I ran my fingers along the spines, a historian's instinct kicking in, but a prickle of unease kept me from truly engaging. There was a sense of waiting, of something dormant that the disturbance of my arrival might awaken. My initial intention had been to catalog the manor's contents, perhaps find some historical artifacts to bolster my research. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, echoed from somewhere upstairs. I froze, straining to hear. It stopped. Probably mice, I told myself, a common problem in old houses. Yet the sound had felt too deliberate, too rhythmic. I found myself drawn to a large, tarnished mirror in the main hall. My reflection looked pale, my eyes wide with a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. I blinked and it was gone. Just the trick of the light, I reasoned, my mind playing tricks in this desolate place. What was this place? And why had it been left to me? The email had been an anomaly, a glitch in the mundane fabric of my existence. A distant relative, a name I vaguely recognized from a faded family tree, had bequeathed me this estate. an estate that, according to the terse legal correspondence, was in dire need of my attention. My current accommodations, a perpetually damp room in a place I'd booked online titled Airbnb in rural area, reviews don't match reality, felt less like a temporary stop and more like a purgatory. The wallpaper peeled in damp curls, the mattress sagged with the weight of countless unseen occupants, and the pervasive odor of mildew clung to everything like a shroud. The drive to the manor was a slow crawl through a landscape that bled into itself. Trees, skeletal and gnarled, clawed at the bruised twilight sky. The gravel road, barely more than a scar on the earth, crunched under the tires, each rotation a protest. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic like old blood. I told myself it was just the decaying vegetation, the natural decomposition of the wild. Then it loomed. Not a grand structure, not a stately home, but a hulking, skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky. The manor. It sagged, as if burdened by the weight of its own history. Gables jutted out like broken teeth, and windows, dark and vacant, stared out like empty sockets. The stone was stained, streaked with the grime of decades, and a creeping vine thick as a man's arm snaked its way up the walls, suffocating the very brickwork. My breath hitched. This was no inheritance, it was a sentence. The gate, wrought iron twisted into grotesque shapes, groaned a mournful welcome as I pushed it open. The hinges shrieked, a sound that scraped against my nerves. The overgrown path was choked with weeds, their brittle stems snapping under my boots. The silence here was different from the silence of my cramped apartment. It didn't have a knocker, only a deep, circular indentation where one might have once been. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak light that pierced a grimy fanlight above the door. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something cloying and sweet like overripe fruit left to rot. My footsteps echoed on the flagstone floor, each sound amplified, swallowed by the vastness. A grand staircase, its banister carved with unsettling figures that seemed to writhe in the dim light, curved upwards into the gloom. I moved deeper into the hall, my senses on high alert. My boots crunched on something that wasn't just dust. I looked down. Small, sharp fragments like broken pottery littered the floor. They gleamed faintly, catching the scant light. I nudged one with my toe. It was smooth, unnervingly so. To my left, a doorway led into what must have been a drawing room. I pulled back one sheet, revealing a velvet armchair, its once-rich color faded to a muted, bruised purple. A faint imprint remained on the seat as if someone had only just risen. I dropped the sheet quickly. My gaze drifted to the walls. I ran my hand over the cool, smooth surface. It felt unnervingly organic, almost like skin. I recoiled, a shiver tracing a path down my spine. It was too low to discern words, a mere exhalation of breath that seemed to brush against my ear. I spun around, but there was nothing. I found myself drawn to a smaller door tucked away beneath the grand staircase. There was no handle, only a series of deeply etched symbols that seemed to twist and writhe, mirroring the carvings on the banister. My historian's mind, usually so eager to categorize and analyze, felt a prickle of unease, a primal instinct screaming a warning. These were not decorative. They felt ancient, potent. Hesitantly, I pressed my hand against the wood. The symbols seemed to shift under my touch, the lines blurring, reforming. A faint scent like damp earth and something sharp like ozone wafted from the cracks. This was not a closet. What lay behind this door? And why did it feel like the very heart of this decaying place? The Airbnb in rural area, reviews don't match reality. It was less rustic charm and more actively decaying. The peeling paint on the porch railings felt like brittle bone under my fingertips. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of dust and something else, something vaguely metallic, like old pennies left to rust. The proprietor, a woman with eyes that darted like trapped birds, had simply handed me a key and scurried away, muttering about seasonal maintenance. Seasonal maintenance that involved cobwebs the size of dinner plates and a persistent draft that whispered through unseen cracks. My own apartment, cramped and noisy, suddenly seemed like a sanctuary but the inheritance. The Manor. It was an obligation, a chance to finally escape the precarious tightrope walk of my freelance research. The email, so formal and out of the blue, had sparked a flicker of something beyond my usual academic curiosity, a genuine, visceral pull. This place, this forgotten corner of the world, held a story, and I was apparently its custodian. I spent the first few days sifting through the detritus of the previous occupants, a process that felt akin to archaeological excavation. Yellowed newspapers, brittle with age, documented local events from decades past. Faded photographs showed stern faces staring out from sepia-toned squares, their eyes holding a silent accusation. The silence of the airbnb was profound, broken only by the groan of the old house settling and the incessant chirping of crickets outside, a sound that felt less like nature and more like a tiny, relentless ticking clock. One afternoon, driven by an inexplicable urge, I found myself in the Manor's seldom-used library. The shelves were warped, bowing under the weight of forgotten tomes. The leather bindings were cracked, the pages brittle and foxed. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak sunlight that managed to pierce the grimy windows. I ran my hand along a row of books, the rough texture of aged paper scratching against my skin. My fingers snagged on something, a loose panel. It was small, unadorned, and surprisingly heavy. My heart gave a strange little lurch. This wasn't just old books, this felt hidden. I pried it open with trembling fingers. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since lost its protective sheen, was a journal. The pages were thin, almost translucent, filled with a spidery, elegant script. The ink, though faded, was still legible. October 17th, 1888, the first entry began. My breath hitched. This was older than I'd anticipated. The harvest was poor again. The earth, it seems, demands more than we can give. They speak of the old ones, of the pact we made. I devoured the pages, my initial academic interest morphing into a gnawing unease. The entries chronicled a community struggling against a harsh environment, their lives dictated by cycles of drought and famine. Mention of offerings, of appeasement, of a hunger that could not be sated. November 3rd, 1888. The ritual was performed. The veil thinned. They say it is for the good of the village, for the land to yield its bounty once more. But the cost is steep. A child no older than 10, chosen. Ritual. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning for more clues. The entries became sparser, the handwriting more frantic. It wakes. The earth trembles, the hunger returns. The keeper's duty is clear. The land remembers, and it demands. The narrative shifted, lists of names accompanied by dates. Each name was followed by a single, cryptic notation, transferred. June 21st, 1905. The bloodline endures. The inheritance passed. The burden remains. The land will not be denied its due. The cycle must continue. My own name, my relative's name, they were not on these lists. But the implication hung heavy in the air, a miasma I could almost taste. The journal hinted at a recurring event, a sacrifice tied to the land's fertility, and a lineage tasked with ensuring it happened. The previous owner, my distant relative, had been the latest in this line. And now it was mine. The metallic scent in the airbnb seemed to intensify, clinging to the back of my throat. The chirping crickets outside no longer sounded like a clock, but like a chorus of tiny, expectant voices. My hands were slick with sweat, the old ones, the hunger. Was it just folklore, or had I inherited a terrifying, tangible legacy? The drive to the airbnb was longer than the listing suggested. The paved road dissolving into a gravel track that spat stones against the undercarriage of my aging sedan. My phone signal had died an hour ago, a silent surrender to the encroaching wilderness. This was supposed to be a retreat, a place to finally organize the chaotic notes from the Manor, to piece together the fragments of that unsettling journal. The listing for airbnb in rural area, reviews don't match reality, had been a joke, I'd thought. A quirky owner trying to be funny. Now, with the last vestiges of daylight bleeding from the bruised sky, The title felt less like a jest and more like a grim prophecy. The cabin, when I finally found it nestled in a thicket of skeletal trees, was a far cry from the sun-drenched haven depicted in the photos. The paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and a single, unblinking window stared out from the shadowed facade. A faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left to rot, hung in the air, mingling with the damp, earthy smell of decay. I pushed open the creaking door, the hinges groaning a protest. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something else. Something metallic like old pennies. My initial unease was a prickle on my skin, easily dismissed as fatigue and the unsettling isolation. I unpacked my meager belongings, the silence of the cabin amplifying every rustle of fabric, every click of a latch. The script was maddeningly elliptical, hinting at cycles, at appeasement, at a hunger that never truly slept. The wind outside had begun to moan, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the very walls. It wasn't a natural wind, I told myself, just the sound of branches scraping against the roof. But the sound carried a cadence, a rhythm that felt deliberate almost, conversational. Then came the tapping. It started softly, a faint tap-tap-tap against the window pane. I froze, my hand halfway to my mouth with the mug. My breath hitched. Rats, I thought, or perhaps a branch finally succumbing to the wind. I forced myself to stand, my legs stiff and unwilling. The tapping continued, steady, insistent. It wasn't the random scrabbling of vermin. It was a distinct pattern. I moved towards the window, my heart a dull thud against my ribs. The glass was grimy, obscuring the view of the night outside. I could see only my own distorted reflection, a pale, wide-eyed stranger staring back. The tapping grew louder, more urgent, as if whatever was out there knew I was approaching. Tap, tap, tap. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like fingernails. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to barricade myself in this damp, decaying box and wait for morning. With a sharp tug, I unlatched the window. It swung inward with a groan, releasing a gust of frigid air that carried the sickeningly sweet scent of rot, now intensified. Nothing. The trees stood like gaunt sentinels, their branches skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. I strained my ears, listening. The tapping had stopped. Of being known. I stepped back from the window, my eyes darting around the room. The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, sharper, like the coppery smell of a fresh wound. I could feel it, a pressure building in the room, a palpable weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then from the corner of the room, a sound, a soft, wet scraping. It came from behind an old, moth-eaten armchair. My gaze snapped to it. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossibly long, unnaturally slender, and tipped with a nail that looked less like keratin and more like polished obsidian. My legs gave way and I stumbled back, hitting the table. The journal pages scattered, fluttering to the floor like dying leaves. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, from the other side of the room. My eyes darted wildly, searching. Was it my imagination? Was the isolation finally getting to me? Then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible indentation appearing in the thick layer of dust on the floor, moving. It was a trail made by something dragging itself, slowly, methodically across the room, and it was heading towards me. What was in this place? And how did it know I was here? The scratching stopped. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thrumming of my own pulse against my ribs. I held my breath, straining to hear anything beyond the blood rushing in my ears. Nothing. Just the settling groans of the old house, the whisper of wind through broken panes. I told myself it was just the wind. Old houses make noise. It was a stupid thought, even to me. The sound hadn't been the wind. My fingers, still clammy, tightened around the cold metal of the latch. The historian in me, the one that had dragged me from my comfortable academic life to this crumbling mausoleum, urged me forward. It was a foolish, dangerous curiosity, but it was all I had left. The alternative was to cower, to let fear consume me, and that felt like a surrender I couldn't afford. Not yet. With a sharp intake of air, I pulled. The latch groaned. a rusty protest against my intrusion. The door swung inward with a long, drawn-out squeal, revealing not the expected storage space but a narrow, descending staircase. Darkness pooled at the bottom, a palpable thing, smelling of damp earth and something else, something cloying and faintly metallic. My stomach lurched. I fumbled for the flashlight on my belt. Its beam, a weak yellow cone, cut a hesitant swat through the gloom. Dust motes danced in its light, disturbed by the sudden influx of air. The steps were rough-hewn stone, worn smooth by countless feet or something else. They led down into the earth. My boots crunched on loose grit as I descended. Each step was a gamble, a descent into the unknown. The metallic scent intensified, mingling with the musty odor of decay. It was the smell of old blood, I realized with a sickening certainty. Not fresh, but ancient, seeped into the very stone. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a small chamber. It was circular, the walls a rough, irregular stone. In the center, a shallow depression in the floor, and in that depression, not just earth, fragments, bone, small, sharp pieces like shards of shattered pottery but brittle and porous. My flashlight beam swept across the chamber, catching on something etched into the far wall, hieroglyphs, or something like them. Strange, angular symbols, arranged in patterns that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. They spoke of cycles, of offerings, of a hunger that could only be sated by a life. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a house. It was a place of worship, a place of sacrifice, and the scratching. It wasn't random. It was a summons. I backed away from the wall, my eyes fixed on the strange symbols. They seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, drawing me in even as they repelled me. I needed to understand. I needed to know what this entity wanted, why it was bound to this place, and what this ritual entailed. There had to be a way, a counter-ritual, a ward, something. Suddenly, a low hum vibrated through the stone floor. It started subtly, a deep resonance that I felt more than heard. Then it grew, a throbbing pulse that seemed to synchronize with my own racing heart. The air grew thick, difficult to breathe. The symbols on the wall began to glow faintly, a sickly, phosphorescent green. Panic clawed at my throat. I scrambled back up the stairs, my hands slipping on the rough stone. The hum intensified, a mournful, insistent drone that seemed to claw at my sanity. I burst back into the main hall, gasping for air. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the flashlight. I stumbled towards the front door, the urge to flee overwhelming. But where would I go? This was the only place, the only connection to what was happening. And the entity, it knew I was here. It knew I was looking. My gaze fell upon the old ledger I'd found earlier, lying open on a dusty table. The last entry, written in a spidery, faded hand, was still visible. The moon wanes. The hunger grows. It calls for the blood of the pure. The blood of the pure. I wasn't pure. I was a historian, a skeptic, a man who had stumbled into a nightmare, or was I? The legend spoke of sacrifices made to appease the land, to ensure prosperity. But the entity's hunger, it felt less like appeasement and more like a predator's need. I looked back at the cellar door, the faint green glow still seeping from beneath it. The hum had stopped, but the silence was more terrifying than the sound of a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. What did it mean, the blood of the pure? And was I already too late to find out? The air in the study hung thick and still, a stagnant breath held for centuries. Dust motes, disturbed by my frantic search, swirled in the single shaft of moonlight piercing the grimy window. The date was etched into my mind, a brand seared onto my consciousness, the solstice. It was here. The airbnb in rural area reviews don't match reality had been a cruel joke, a lure into this decaying trap. Now the trap was sprung and I was the bait. My fingers, raw from scrabbling at loose floorboards and prizing open stubborn drawers, trembled. The journal, bound in what felt disturbingly like dried skin, lay open on the heavy oak desk. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, whispered of a pact, a bargain struck between the first inhabitants of this cursed place and something ancient, something hungry. They called it the Whispering Maw. Not a god, not a demon, but a fundamental hunger of the earth itself, fed by life. The text spoke of pure blood, a concept that had eluded me until now. I wasn't pure. I'd loved, I'd lusted, I'd lived a life tangled with the messy, imperfect essence of humanity. But the entity, the maw, it didn't care for nuances. It craved a specific kind of offering, a vibrant spark, untainted by the world's grime. And the legends, the scattered fragments I'd pieced together, all pointed to the solstice as the time of its deepest yearning. A floorboard creaked upstairs. My breath hitched. It wasn't the settling of an old house. This sound had a deliberate weight, a slow, measured tread. My muscles tensed, coiling like a spring. I was alone, or I had been. I pushed myself away from the desk, the wooden chair scraping a protest against the stone floor. My eyes darted to the door, then to the narrow, leaded window. Escape was a childish fantasy. The grounds were vast, the nearest village miles away, and even if I reached it, who would believe me? Another creak closer this time. The sound was accompanied by a faint, earthy smell, like freshly turned soil after a rain, but wrong. Too rich, too fertile, it filled my nostrils, clinging to the back of my throat. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. My heart, that traitorous organ, began to thud a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Not pounding, no, that was too dramatic. It was a dull, insistent ache, a heavy weight pressing down. I backed away from the desk, my gaze fixed on the study door. The carvings on the walls, once dismissed as mere ornamentation, now seemed to writhe with a subtle, unsettling life. Twisted vines, grasping hands, gaping mouths, they were all there, staring. A low scraping sound emanated from the hallway, like something heavy being dragged across stone. It was slow, agonizingly so, each drag a tiny hammer blow against my fraying nerves. My skin prickled. My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms. The journal lay open, its secrets laid bare. The maw's hunger, the solstice, sacrifice. It all coalesced, a terrible, inevitable truth. They hadn't built this place for shelter, they had built it as an offering. And I, by inheriting it, by disturbing its slumber, had made myself the prime candidate. The scraping stopped. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow. The air felt thinner, harder to draw into my lungs. Then a soft, rhythmic tapping began, not on the door but on the window pane. Tap. Slow, deliberate. I forced myself to look. Outside, in the moonlit gloom, a figure stood. It was unnervingly still, and its hand, pale and skeletal, was raised, its fingertips gently tapping against the glass. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were too long, too thin. They seemed to bend at impossible angles. The tapping continued, a hypnotic rhythm that drew my gaze. Tiny tendrils of ice snaked across the pane, obscuring the figure, obscuring the world beyond. The earthy smell intensified, now tinged with something metallic, like old blood. The journal's final entry flashed in my mind. The blood of the pure, a balm, the blood of the tainted, a poison, but the maw, it consumes all. What if the legends were wrong? What if the pure wasn't about innocence, but about a specific lineage? What if my very presence, my tainted blood, was anathema to it? Could I use that? Could I be the poison instead of the offering? The tapping stopped. The ice on the window began to melt, dripping slowly down the pane like tears. The figure remained, a silhouette against the dying moonlight. It raised its other hand, and the door to the study, without a sound, began to swing inward. A gust of cold air carrying that rich, loamy scent swept into the room. I could feel the maw's awareness, a vast, ancient consciousness that had been dormant for too long, now stirring, and it was focused entirely on me. My mind raced, a desperate scramble for an answer, a way out, a weapon. The journal offered no escape, only a grim inevitability. But the entity, the maw, it was a force of nature, not a sentient being with predictable desires. If it craved life, what would it do with death? My death, if it was a tainted death, would it sate it or sicken it? The cloaked figure took a step into the room. The earthy scent was overwhelming now, suffocating. It was at the threshold, waiting for me. My gaze fell upon the ornate but heavy fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. A primitive tool against an unimaginable foe, but it was all I had. Would a desperate act of defiance, a sacrifice of my own making, be enough to break this ancient cycle? Or would it merely be the final, futile gesture of a lamb led to slaughter? The choice, stark and brutal, lay before me. To surrender, to become the offering, or to fight, to risk becoming something far worse. The tapping ceased. A brittle silence descended, heavier than the falling snow outside. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the cavernous room. The ice on the window pane, a latticework of frozen fear, began to weep. Each drop a tiny, echoing plink against the warped wood of the sill. It wasn't a melting of warmth, I knew that. It was a surrender, a concession. My hand, still slick with the strange, viscous fluid, trembled. I'd smeared it across the runes, a desperate, unthinking act born of primal terror. The blood, my blood. The legend spoke of purity, of an offering untouched. I had no such claim. My life was a tapestry of compromises, of small, ignoble sins. Yet here I was, the anathema, the poison. The air thrummed, a low vibration that settled in my teeth. It wasn't a sound, not precisely, but a sensation, like standing too close to a colossal, slumbering engine. The oppressive weight in the room shifted, lightened, then returned, a slow, agonizing inhale and exhale. I braced myself, waiting for the scream, the rending of fabric, the visceral tearing that my imagination had so vividly painted. Nothing, just the drip, drip, drip of melting ice. I forced myself to move, my joints stiff, protesting. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign, any indication that I hadn't just sealed my doom. My gaze fell upon the ornate wooden chest, the one that had held the journal. It was closed, not locked, just settled, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. Had I been meant to find that journal, or was it a trap, a lure to draw me deeper into this forgotten lineage, to prepare me for this moment? A faint, sickly sweet odor, like overripe fruit left to rot, tickled my nostrils. It was new. It hadn't been there before. I took a tentative step towards the chest. My boots crunched on something small, something granular. I looked down. Tiny fragments of bone, bleached white, lay scattered across the floorboards. Not human, I hoped. Not from any recent meal. The entity hadn't vanished. I felt it, a vast, ancient presence, now withdrawn, observing. It was like a predator that had been offered a less desirable prey and had grudgingly accepted, but grudgingly. The tension remained, a taut wire stretched across the room, ready to snap. I reached the chest, my fingers brushing against the cool, polished wood. It was intricately carved, depicting scenes of harvest, of abundance, of life. But woven into the very grain were unsettling details. Grasping hands, wide, unseeing eyes, figures contorted in silent screams. A perverted bounty. What had my blood done, or had it in its very impurity changed something? Was I now a part of the ritual, but not as the sacrifice? Had I become the blight, the contaminant that spoiled the offering? A slow, deliberate sound, not the frantic scuttling of vermin. This was heavy, measured. My head snapped up. I hadn't heard that before. The house was old, settling, I told myself, but the sound had a rhythm, a purpose. The air grew heavy again, the earthy scent intensifying, mingling with something metallic like old pennies. There was the entity merely regrouping. There was this a temporary reprieve, a pause before a more terrible conclusion. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this place, this cursed inheritance, and never look back. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. The journal, the chest, the very walls seemed to hold me captive. I glanced back at the window. The ice had melted completely now, leaving only streaks of condensation. The snow outside had stopped falling. The world beyond the manor walls was eerily still. My gaze drifted back to the staircase. It didn't move like a human, it flowed, it seeped. And as it began its descent, a low, guttural sound like stones grinding together echoed from its direction. Had I truly outsmarted it, or merely delayed the inevitable? The chill of the air in rural area, reviews don't match reality, seeped into my bones, a different kind of cold than the biting wind that had once assailed Blackwood Manor. This was a damp, pervasive chill, like a forgotten cellar, and it clung to the peeling floral wallpaper and the stained, threadbare carpets. The reviews had promised rustic charm, a cozy escape. They'd lied. Every creak of the floorboards above, every rustle of unseen vermin in the walls, was a phantom echo of the manor's groans. I traced the condensation on the window pane with a fingertip, the glass slick and unnervingly warm. Outside, a relentless drizzle smeared the already muted landscape into a watercolor of gray and green. It had been 6 months since I'd fled Blackwood, since I'd slammed the heavy oak door shut. The echoing thud, a final punctuation mark on a chapter I desperately wanted to forget. But forgetting was a luxury I no longer possessed. Now, my reality was woven with the threads of an ancient, insatiable hunger. This airbnb, a last-minute booking found through a desperate late-night search, was meant to be a sanctuary. Instead, it felt like another cage, albeit one with a more modern, pathetic facade. Pages filled with frantic scribbles, charcoal sketches of sigils that still made my skin crawl, and photocopied passages from forbidden texts. My hands trembled as I reached for the mug of lukewarm tea, the ceramic ruff against my palm. It tasted of dust and disappointment, a world I no longer truly belonged to. The entity, the nameless thing that had stirred within the earth beneath Blackwood, wasn't a figment of my deteriorating psyche. It was real, and it was still there, waiting for the cycle to begin anew. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, a low moan that seemed to carry on its breath the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid and metallic. Nothing but my own gaunt face staring back, etched with a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, Marcus, the historian who craved uncovering forgotten truths, had unearthed a truth so terrible it had fractured my perception of reality. The academic curiosity that had driven me to Blackwood had been a naive, dangerous folly. I had sought knowledge and I had found oblivion. I picked up a worn leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. This was the journal of the previous owner, the distant relative whose name I'd barely known. His final entries were a descent into madness, a frantic chronicle of sleepless nights and inexplicable occurrences. He wrote of a growing unease, a sense of being watched, of a presence that fed on fear and despair. He spoke of the land itself, of its ancient, insatiable thirst. He had been the sacrifice, the one before me, and he had left me the keys to his undoing. I closed the journal, the soft thud of the cover a stark contrast to the violent finality I'd heard at Blackwood. Here, in this sterile, impersonal room, the horror felt more insidious, more personal. My fingers traced the faded inscription on the journal's cover, a symbol I'd seen etched into the very foundations of Blackwood. It was a ward, a plea for protection, and a testament to the enduring power of the entity. The same symbol I'd found myself sketching unconsciously, even here on a napkin stained with coffee. My head snapped up, my breath catching in my throat. It was just the old building settling, I told myself. Just the wind. I looked out at the relentless rain, at the blurred, indistinct trees that seemed to press in on the small cabin. The reviews had promised a peaceful retreat. They had promised a different reality. And I, in my desperate need for an escape, had fallen for it, just as I had fallen for the allure of Blackwood's secrets. The tapping had stopped at the Manor. But here, in this airbnb in rural area, reviews don't match reality. A new rhythm had begun. A subtle, persistent drumming against the fragile walls of my sanity. Was this all that was left? The rain continued to fall, each drop a tiny, insistent question mark against the glass, and I had no answers.